Okay, so this is our final exam review, last class of the semester. Welcome back. And for those of you watching remotely, we're going to go through chapters 7 through 13 in your book. The final exam is comprehensive of those 7 chapters, and there are 3 questions per chapter. I think there might be one chapter that got cheated and only got 2, and another that got 4, but you'll have 21 multiple choice questions, and then there will be a couple of problems to solve. And so we'll go through the topics for the final exam, and I can't tell you how to answer them, but what I can do is tell you what to concentrate in terms of what you study. So let's take a look at the first topic in Chapter 7. If you remember, Chapter 7 is all about budgeting, and in the first section of your book, you had some information about Section 7.1, about budgeting in general, and then it gave you a schematic of the different types of budgets and how they fit together. And so I would encourage you to be familiar with figure 7.6, which is that schematic about operating budgets, financial budgets, and that sort of thing. So if you look at it in your book, it kind of looks like I don't know, dominoes or something like that, all different colors. But be familiar with that in the first section of your book. So then, in addition to that, the book goes through and talks about how to calculate various measures of production, and one of the measures of production that they talk about are units of production. And you can see that in the middle of your chapter, in section 7.2, there's a little green box that talks about how to calculate the number of units produced, and there's also discussion about units in production and that sort of thing. So be familiar with production budgets and how to make those sorts of calculations. And let's see what else we have here. And also be familiar with financial budgets. I think that's section, let's see, what is that, section 7.3, and how to prepare financial budgets. If you're still coming in, if you haven't signed in, go ahead. There's a sign-in sheet here. You have to sign your whole name today. I didn't print the roster. I thought it would be easier for you all, for me to remember who was here as opposed to trying to calculate who wasn't here. So anyhow, that's where we stand. We actually have a better turnout than I expected, so that's a good thing. So that's budgeting. Obviously, we had some problems on budgeting and variances, which takes us into our next chapter, which is Chapter 8. So let's take a look at Chapter 8. And you remember in Chapter 8, we had several learning objectives. We had to learn about how and why standard costs were developed. We had to compute and evaluate materials variances, compute and evaluate labor variances, compute and evaluate overhead variances. And what we looked at in that chapter is a schematic that became very familiar to us during our week in Chapter 8. And there's a good example of it. Let's see here if I can scroll down to it. And maybe I should put this up on the screen. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, let's put it up on the screen. So. So for those of you who are watching at home, and for those of you who can't read the teeny tiny print up here, this is figure 8.3 in your book, which is in section 8.2 of the textbook. And so this shows the calculation and the relation of the variances for direct materials. And then you'll remember we saw one that was just like it for direct labor in the next section, and then for overhead, at least for variable overhead, in the following chapter. And let's see if I seem to have lost my markers here. Let's see if there's one behind me. Yeah. Might be out of luck as far as putting it on the board today. Let's see what I can find here. Let's see what we got. Okay, let's take a short time out. Be right back. It appears someone has collected all the markers in all the classrooms, and I forgot to bring mine today because I didn't have to bring most of my notes. Okay, so you'll remember that the schematic kind of worked like this. You had actual quantity times actual price, and you had actual quantity times the standard price, and then that gave you your direct materials price variance. And then over here you had what is the standard quantity times standard price. And that gave you your direct materials quantity variance. And you remember the labor variance was just, kind of the same thing, except we called it rate instead of price and efficiency instead of quantity. And then these variances together gave you your direct materials total variance. And when you're talking about costs, as we are here, you're talking about your budgeted costs. If you're going under what the standards were, then that's favorable, right? Because you're saving money. If you're going over what the standards are, that's unfavorable. Okay, because you're going over budget. So those are things to remember for Chapter 8. And if you learn that, I think you're going to be in pretty good shape for questions that you get regarding Chapter 8. Let's see if there's anything else. Well, we did have to explain why we had variances. So be aware of the possible costs, the possible reasons for variances as well. And when you, I think that what you're going to find is you may have a problem or two where you have to know this well and use this well, and also be able to explain the various factors that could lead to a variance. So, perhaps hiring cheaper workers gives you a favorable variance with respect to rate, but maybe they don't work as well, and so you have a less favorable, maybe an unfavorable variance with respect to efficiency, or perhaps even to the use of materials. So anyhow, that's variances for Chapter 8. Now this may go a whole lot faster than just 50 minutes, so anyhow, we may have kind of a short day today. But I'm also available to answer your questions once we get finished with my part of the presentation. Okay, so then we went on to Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 was about responsibility accounting and decentralization. And so we spent the first couple of sections of the chapter just kind of talking about centralized and decentralized management. And if you remember, that was kind of heavy on theory. And then we got into responsibility centers and looked at some of the accounting techniques for evaluating responsibility centers and looking at the different types of budgets for cost centers, for revenue centers, for profit centers, and what was the other one? Investment centers. So those were different types of responsibility centers that we looked at. And you'll remember that we looked at a lot of different variances. We compared actual to budgeted results and tried to explain why we had differences in what we were expecting. And so that was Chapter 9. So if we were looking at some questions for Chapter 9, then some of the things that we might take a look at are, I don't know, how organizational charts work in different types of organizations, about the types of responsibility centers, and then also about what's controllable and uncontrollable for different types of responsibility centers. So what are things that managers can have an impact on, and what are things that are sort of outside of their control because of the type of the center they're running. Okay. Now, if you just come in, if you haven't signed in on the sign-in sheet, go ahead. It's up here up front. Make sure that I know that you were here. So that's Chapter 9, and we went through lots of examples of the results of different types of responsibility centers. You remember we had the apparel store that had the snowstorm and some of the other things like that. So you could expect to see a covering of those materials as well as some of the different types of costs, ones that are controllable, ones that are uncontrollable, and that sort of thing. Sadly, you will not see transfer pricing or international tax planning on the final exam. I decided to exclude that, so you don't have to study transfer pricing. Okay, Chapter 10 was short-term decision-making, and we had the example of the whether or not to recycle the coffee grounds from the coffee bar, and how we might make a decision. Now, this was, I think, for managerial accounting, as you guys go out into the world, going after internships or going to get a job. This is one of these, kind of tricks, okay? These are one of the kind of key things in Chapter 10 that you should be expected to know, or that things that if somebody challenges in an interview and says, well, what did you learn in accounting? You can say, well, I learned how to decide whether or not to, sell something as it is or process further. I know how to evaluate that. Or I know how to evaluate, whether to make something internally, or, to outsource it. Or I know, whether or not to, but maybe don't tell them, whether or not to shut down the division. They might take that the wrong way. But those are all techniques that you find, or whether to take a special order. So those techniques in sections 10.2, 10.3, 10.4, 10.5, those are all things that you know how to do now that a lot of people don't know how to do. Okay, so if you were going into a situation in which, you're trying to get a job, maybe starting in the accounting department, and they want to, they want to know if you know QuickBooks or if you have any of that sort of stuff. You can say, yeah, but I also know how to do, certain projects, so if you have questions about this, I can do the quantitative work, and I'm familiar, with some of the qualitative factors that affect it. And so those are all good things to note. So, whether or not to accept or reject a special order, whether or not to make something or outsource it, those are all things that I would be familiar with and be ready to discuss on the final exam, as well as when you go out into the workforce and are trying to explain what value you could be to a potential employer. Or if you start your own business, I mean, it's good to know that stuff too. And so some of the things that you'll see are questions about advantages and disadvantages of things like outsourcing or taking a special order, or possibly whatever those sorts of decisions. When a segment should be dropped, and then also remember when we got into the last section of the materials, and let me get to that. Let's see where I am here. I'm in the wrong chapter. Hang on. Oh, I need to plug this back in. Okay, the whole thing about when resources are constrained. So as you're studying, and you've got the question, about whether to do desks or, desks or bookcases or chairs, know this material. So know this about the contribution margin, and how to prioritize your production. And then also maybe some of the decision factors that are qualitative factors that would affect that decision as well. So all this stuff here at the end of section 10.6 are things that you may run into in your final exam. Okay, let's go on to chapter 11. And chapter 11 was the one that had some questions about the capital budgeting decisions and whether or not to keep and repair or replace machinery as it becomes older and perhaps more obsolete. And so these are all important questions for chapter 11. Now let's take a quick look at what we have chapter 11 in terms of our questions here. So in chapter 11, some of the questions that you're going to have are going to involve whether or not to make certain capital decisions under different types of analyses. And remember, when we were talking in chapter 11, we had our initial screening decisions that oftentimes were things like the accounting rate of return or the payback period. Are we going to make our money back soon enough, Are we going to meet at least a minimum accounting level rate of return? And then a more sophisticated set of analyses that involve the time value of money. And so as you're studying and trying to do your final exam, it may be helpful to you let me see if I can get into Wolf Den here, to go back and to consider using that little worksheet that we put into your coursework to help you calculate present value and future value type calculations. And so you remember that we had this Excel schedule that we uploaded. Let's see if I can figure out how to get this on the, so I got to go into the assignment. Yeah. There we go. Instructions and files. So possibly before you take your final exam, you might want to just open up this worksheet and play around with it a little bit and just make sure that you know how it works and how to modify it and how to use it to make some of these calculations, and make sure you understand which worksheet to use for which type of exercise. So that's something that you might find helpful prior to taking the final exam, and then be familiar with what net present value is, what internal rate of return is, and discounted cash flow models. So those are all important topics that you may see sometime soon. Okay, let's see what we got. Oh, that's chapter 8. I don't want to be there. And then, be prepared to talk about, how those quantitative calculations can be used to make a decision, and, to think about some of the things that they talk about in the chapter about the qualitative factors as well. So if you're making a decision in an industry that's kind of old and stable and kind of a cash flow, cash cow kind of product, if you're making Campbell soup or Cheerios, it's different than if you're competing with Tesla or Apple or Google in a highly competitive technological based situation where things are changing all the time and people are always coming up with new ideas. So it's going to affect the time value of money calculations and how much of a discount you need to put on your decisions. So just keep that in mind. Okay, then in chapter 12, we got into the balanced scorecard and performance measurement. This was the person who had the dorm room cleaning business, and the questions that we had here were all about ways to try to combine both the quantitative and qualitative analysis that you would find in making one of these decisions. So first of all, if you're trying to come up with a performance management system, you want to make sure that you're able to achieve goal congruity. So understand what goal congruity is and whose goals need to be pointed in the right direction, in the same direction. And then understand the difference between the interests of different stakeholders and what the definition of stakeholders is. And then also understand the quantitative and qualitative factors that go into the balanced scorecard and that sort of thing. So that's chapter 12, and It's a little more touchy-feely, but still has some important concepts. And then when you get into Chapter 13, now we're looking at sustainability accounting and that sort of thing. And so it's hard to write good exam questions about this, but this is basically just knowing some of the sustainability initiatives like the Paris Agreement on climate change and the GRI and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's standards and where they come from. So those are pretty much your, as far as the multiple choice questions go, those are the areas to be focused on. And I think all of you are familiar with how we do multiple choice questions. So I think you'll do quite well on that. Then be familiar for our short answer problems. You're going to want to know how to calculate and explain variances. That's your Chapter 8 kind of material. And take a look. One thing that I would study in particular with respect to Chapter 8, let me see if I can get into it. See if I can find this. There's a comprehensive problem at the end of the chapter. The barley incorporated production. And I would strongly recommend that you take a look at that particular problem. That let's see if it's got a label on it. No, it's just called barley incorporated production. So take a look at that, which is toward the end of Chapter 8, Section 8.5 in Chapter 8, and see what you can learn from that. We could go through that some if you wanted to. But let me see. Let me also talk about some of the other things that are important for the problems. Okay, we've got also be familiar with, I think there was a question in, let me go back to the chapter here. We did all these exercises during the course of the decision making for, whether to make or buy and that sort of thing. And there was a good example in the discussion, I think, of the cup lid company. So what was that called? Thermal mugs, and whether or not to make themselves or buy. So please be familiar with that type of analysis. And then last but not least, just be familiar with all the time value of money analysis that we had in Chapter 11 it was, for making capital decisions. So be familiar with that, as well as the non-time value factor. So just basically be familiar with the whole chapter, Chapter 11, and that's pretty much it. Now, did anybody come with any specific questions? Any? Yeah. Excuse me? The exam is going to be uploaded in just a day or two. It's already written. I'm just going to make it available to you after I've got all the homework in and have that all graded. And then it'll be due on December 4th. So keep checking Wolfden, and I will send out an email when I've released the final exam. But it'll either be November, let's see, what's today? Today's the 28th. It'll either be Wednesday or Thursday that I'll put it up live. So, and that's true for all three of my classes. Yeah. Excuse me? kicked in. So yeah, December 4th. At 11:55, and I think that's a Sunday night. So, you know, you can, if you have, 4 or 5 days to work on it, you can decide when you want to do it. But Sunday night, at 5 minutes to midnight, the carriage turns back into a pumpkin. So, and at that point, I have to start grading it because I have to have your grades in. So I've got some people in my class who are graduating in December. So I've got to have my grades in by the 6th. So that, for 70-some students, that gives me not much time to grade things. So, other questions? Anything else? Okay, well, it has been a pleasure having you all this semester, and I know you're all going to do well. You all are the people who probably didn't have to come to this review session, but you're here, so I have high hopes for all of you. And those of you who are just watching, okay, work hard, and hope you all travel safely, and hope to see some of you in the spring. So don't forget to, if you need something to do in January, sign up for my VITA course, BUA 480. You can do it online. It does have a small service commitment, but that service commitment, a lot of it can be done online also. So good luck to everybody.